ভারতীয় চিত্রকলার অন্যতম পথিকৃৎ এবং প্রবাদ প্রতিম ব্যক্তিত্ব শ্রী জি সুব্রমণিয়ামকে আজকে আমরা আমাদের ভেতরে পেয়েছি। নন্দনকে অবলম্বন করে এবং নন্দন তত্ত্বকে নিয়ে তার সুদীর্ঘ জীবনের যে পথ চলা, সেই পথ চলা কখনো ছাত্র হিসেবে, কখনো অধ্যাপক হিসেবে এবং কখনো আত্মমগ্ন একজন স্রষ্টা হিসেবে। তার কাছে আমরা জানতে চাইব যে তার প্রথম জীবনের একদম তিনি যখন ছোট ছিলেন কেরালাতে তার জীবনের কথা। তারপরে আমরা একে একে জানব ম্যাড্রাস প্রেসিডেন্সিতে ইকোনমিক্স নিয়ে পড়বার সময় তিনি গান্ধীজির আদর্শে উদ্বুদ্ধ হয়ে স্বদেশের যে আন্দোলন চলছিল সেই আন্দোলনে গিয়েছিলেন।
Really speaking, I was born in Kerala and in a place called Palghat.
Yeah, Palghat is very famous.
Palghat is famous because it is the kind of a passage from Tamil Nadu to Kerala. So there are a number of people settled there who have grown up in both the cultures. And then Palghat later became quite famous because some of this nation's biggest singers, musicians, scientists came from Palghat.
It belongs to that particular place.
But then that is no credit to me. I was there by accident. And I was not there for very long either. I was there only, I think, when I was, till I was, I think, 5 to 6 years old. By that time, my elder brother, who was 30 years older than me, had become the vice principal of an English school in Mahe, which was a French possession on the west coast of India, Mahe. Mahe is still under the Pondicherry state, but at that time Mahe was a very little place. It was the first time that Mahe was getting an English school, probably because French education either had to take them to France for employment or to one of the French colonies.
Yeah.
So my childhood years was in Mahe. Mahe was not a very distinguished place at that time. It was very small. The Mahe I am talking about was only about 1 square mile of territory. Its speciality was, as I remember, it was a free port. So people were interested in smuggling out of Mahe things they could get. And largely, I have heard, it was silver, diamonds, silk, and foreign liquor. And Mahe itself, I understand, had about 30 to 32 liquor shops. People came there to drink and make merry. So, anyway, it was the kind of town I grew up in. But then, Mahe also was a political underground.
Freedom fighters.
No, not only freedom fighters, people who thought in terms of changing society.
Okay.
In fact, in those days, in the times I was a small boy, Marxism was supposed to be a very dangerous sort of ideology. So Marxism has to grow underground. So all of us were sort of introduced to Marxism when we were small children through little clubs where grown-up people discussed things about the world and the various problems it had and the solutions they were thinking of. So that's it. In fact, that probably happened elsewhere, even in Bengal. during the Anushilan Samiti's time.
Yes.
In Bengal too, there were two kinds of ways of getting people, young people interested. One was physical clubs, another was rationalist societies. Between those three things, they didn't have a political color at that time. But when they got interested in one thing or the other, slowly they started discussing political questions. So really speaking, even before I had read anything of Das Kapital or something of that kind, I had a fairly sort of a, I think, creditable idea of what Marxism was and what it wanted to do and things like that. And that was true with many young people of that time. But by the time I reached the the matriculation standard, I had started thinking whether class war was a good solution or not, whether the classes will probably come to peace after fighting or will they go on fighting for them, and whether all the classes will not have to cooperate to build a society that we want to build. So that is where I got interested in the ideas of Gandhi. And that was more or less after the 1930s, that 39. So by that time, Gandhi's ideas were fairly widespread in India. In fact, Gandhi was a wonderful phenomenon in India. I do not know that at that time when I was a young man or a child, many people knew about Gandhi, and there were the people who did not even read a newspaper, had probably not seen his image, and there were no cinemas which showed his image indoors. But Gandhi was in the air. Gandhi was almost like a kind of a climate. I mean, he came into it. My mother knew about Gandhi much closely without ever going into the political ramifications of his thought or things of that kind. So it was the kind of what exposure to Marxism and later Gandhian ideology left me with well, if we have to do anything in this world, political emancipation itself was not enough. You have to build up the world, you have to regenerate yourself, you have to make yourself something better than what you are, kind of a thing. Now, there was another thing which worked there. In French India, there was a small library which I went to very often. And when I went to school, people thought that I had some kind of a talent for art. Well, it was natural. I didn't think terribly much of it at that time. But when I went into the library, the reading room, there were 2 or 3 things which interested me. One were the French magazines, especially one magazine called Illustration, which always carried works of modern art, ancient art, primitive art and things of that kind in very sort of a delightful reproductions. So I had a broad kind of exposure to these kinds of art. The other thing was the library sort of subscribed to Modern Review. In fact, there is no Modern Review now. But in the days I was growing up, Modern Review was a phenomenon itself. It was more or less a bridge between the cultural scene in India and the cultural scene in Europe. And of course, at the center of that was Rabindranath Tagore and the people around him. So, quite early in life, I knew about what Rabindranath was writing about or was thinking about and what his educational ideas was. So I used to think, why the hell am I rotting here instead of going to an institution like that?
Yes, in that case, just I like to ask that what makes you uh, just change your decision to come to Shantiniketan instead of completing your economics at Madras Presidency?
Come. It's a whole story. I came there by default, not by choice. So, what I'm going to say is I had that kind of an interest. But then I knew that in the kind of economic situation we were, we could not move from Kerala to Bengal for studies and come. And there were a lot of people who went from Kerala to Bengal at that time, either as teachers or students, but they were generally from the affluent families. Anyway, in my case, it didn't happen for more than one reason. I was getting interested in the local political scene. Then, of course, my elder brother thought if I got too much interested in the local political scene in Mahe, the French government will get aware of the whole thing. So he sent me for the next step of education, that is in those days what was called FA, to a Christian institution in Mangalore, St. Aloysius College, which is still there. It's a sort of a reputed institute. There, of course, I was out of contact with the kind of environment I grew up with, but then I spent about 2 years reading up whatever I could read. So that made me a little more mature in terms of ideas and things of that kind. Then, when I passed that, I became the results were good. So my father thought that I should go for further studies. In those days, further studies, most of the people who did well in studies went to one of the major colleges in South India, including the one in Madras, the Presidency College. And most of the people were sort of preferred to go to what would you call economics. I suppose they do now too, because economics opens out for various kinds of professional options. I was not interested really in professional options. So I told my father I would rather go for literature rather than for economics. But he said, if you want to do literature, why do you want to go to a college to learn how to write? You can always do so. So you do your lectures and then you do your writing, whatever way. Well, anyway, I did not defy him. I went for an economic degree. In those days, the Presidency College, Madras, was a very kind of a special kind of college. I don't think that college has any more that kind of an atmosphere. The students were few and it was very selective. When I went into economic stream, there were only 6 of us in the class, and I had the privilege of walking out of a class if I wanted to. That was accepted. If I wanted to go to the library and sit and read instead of sort of hearing the blah blah of the lecturers, I could do that. I very often did not go either to the library or the lecture room. There was an aquarium in front, and I used to go and sit in the aquarium. But it was a very good experience. Well, I started there. But it was at that time that Gandhi started the Quit India movement. So naturally, I was involved with it. And when the Quit India movement started, I was one of the leaders of the strike. So, well, again, without thinking in terms of political action beforehand, I was thrown into political action of some kind. Well, we did that for about 2 or 3 weeks, I think. We closed down the shop for a while. Later it opened, and we had to go to classes. Though the police wanted to, at least some of us, to catch us in the college. But we had a very nice Scottish principal called Pepworth, who said, I won't let the police come into my college campus to catch anybody, because these boys are like my children, sort of thing. After that, we waited. The Quit India movement did not get into full steam as we thought. So, and then it cooled down, especially after a year, sometime. So then the student leaders of different institutions got together, and we thought we should make something more spectacular. So it was at that time that we went, and I think it was in 1943, went and picketed the secretariat and tried to.
That's in Madras?
Madras secretariat. Then we were caught and we were sentenced to different
Jails.
sort of. I went to jail for 6 months.
6 months.
We were sent to jail a little far away in what was called Alipuram jail, which is very near Bellary. Bellary.
Yeah.
It is called Alipuram jail because at one time it was Hyder Ali's stable, which the British made into a jail, especially when they had to send large numbers of the Mapula rebellion people from Kerala. So there were camp jail, so we went there for that. It was an interesting experience, in the sense that on one side there were young hopefuls like us who were thinking of changing the world. There was, on the other hand, people who wanted to get into political power. There were some people who were mature and who had something to tell us. There were some people who wanted to take advantage of every situation and become better. So by the time I finished my 6 months and came out, I thought that political career was not for me. But then I wanted to get involved in something which related to either social or cultural regeneration. And in the meanwhile, what had happened was, when I had not still gone to jail, I was staying in a downtown hotel in Madras, and I had a visitor there, young man, who once saw that I was scribbling away in my sort of a sketch pad, and I was doing something on the wall. So he said, will you sort of let me borrow a few of these things from you? So I said, what will you do with it? He said, I'll tell you later. He was a sort of a clerk. He was a Kerala boy. He was a clerk in the art school in Madras. So he took this and showed it to one of the sort of now quite well-known sort of artists and art teachers is Panika. And Panika was a favorite student and teacher of Devi Prasad Roy Chaudhary. So Devi Prasad saw the drawings And he was an impulsive man. He sent me a note almost the day after, with a sort of a liveried servant in those days. He was, after all, the first Indian principal of a sort of a respectable art school. And the note was very nice. I mean, it's very touching, saying that you are in the wrong place. Art school is where you should be. And, so that put a little bit of an idea in my mind. So
this type of incident influenced you and
right.
encouraged you.
So encourage, I don't know, but then the whole question is that probably it is possible for you to sort of do something as an artist.
Yes.
So when I came back from prison, my brother knew this. So my brother, without even telling me, wrote to Nandalal Bose, saying that this is it, I have a brother of this kind, and his background, he has had a good background of education and things of that kind, but he wants to be an artist, or he has the talent to be one. So will you expect him? Well, in 1944, February early, we got a telegram from Nandalal Bose. Come
Your
over.
brother is known to Nandalal Bose
No.
earlier?
No.
Not at all.
No. He sort of took a chance.
Okay.
In fact, Nandalal Bose were not known to me. He didn't even know whether I was an artist of any kind. But he said, come over. It should have been the story that I was in the freedom movement, that I had a background of this.
And as a student of economics.
No, that might not have impressed him, because I have heard Nandalal did not like university-trained people.
Okay.
I have heard that whenever a student came with a kind of a background of higher education, ওদের কিছু হবে না, ওরা জেটা হয়ে যায়. But he was wrong. In fact, Nandalal's reputation all stands on the contribution of people who have had such education. But anyway, after all, each teacher has his own ideas about what he thinks should be right or wrong. So that's how I reached Shantiniketan by default.
Then from South India, you came down to Shantiniketan.
That's right.
That was
Up. That's it.
And then, just I would like to know some of your experience with Nandalal, Ramkinkar Bej, and especially Binod Bihari at the Shantiniketan.
I can't say anything. I can only say that when I came to Shantiniketan, at that time, these three, whom I say the three murtis of Kalabhavana, were there, and nobody else was there. So I was in the front of these three murtis from the beginning. And then Master Mashai asked me, so why don't you do some paintings that I can see? And the two paintings I did in the beginning impressed him quite well. So he took it to the other teachers, and they were all very happy. So in a sense, I had the privilege of being introduced to the three main pillars of Kalabhavan's reputation from the beginning itself. But then Nandalal was quite pleased with me at that time, but he was not quite pleased with me later. Because Nandalal was thinking still in terms of building a national kind of a style of painting. Later he changed the whole idea, but then at that time he thought. So whenever somebody sort of put in various other kinds of details in, he got a little upset. And unfortunately, the kind of my reading and visual exposure to various other kinds of art naturally brought it all in. So once he called me and said, "You dress like an Indian, but you think like a European." Then suddenly he, after that, felt that was not the right thing to say. So he said, "Why don't you go to Binod Bihari? He will explain things to you better." So that's how I came to know Binod Bihari for the first time. And Binod Bihari was an unusually intelligent man. He had a background of reading which was for that time for me sort of excellent. He had a visual memory which was, astounded everyone. Then, in spite of his bad eyesight, he was doing works which were wonderful. So, really speaking, Binod Bihari was a great person to be with. And since I had interest both in drawing and painting from the beginning, and then in sculpture, I became close to Ram Kinkar too. So very often Ram Kinkar and I used to go sketching out into the countryside together. I didn't do much sketching, I only did the watching. But then that watching was a great education.
Definitely. Observation can make you a complete person.
I suppose so.
And sir, I like to know another thing. What is your personal view about teacher Nandalal at Shantiriketan?
You see, Nandalal was a sort of a man who wanted to analyze the whole system of creativity.
Okay.
Many of Nandalal's close students never realized it. This is the whole thing. It is like Ramakrishna Paramahansa's close sort of admirers do not understand what Ramakrishna was. What did Nandalal want to do? In fact, his speciality of Nandalal was something which today would be considered very modern. He had, as I told you in the beginning, he thought there was something called a sort of Indian way of doing things. Then he slowly found that the Indian way sort of drew from various other ways. The Mughal miniatures have things of Persian influence, and if you think of the early Indian art, it had Persian sculptures influence and things of that kind. So really speaking, he slowly found that each country had a certain sort of visual exposure to various environmental facts. And out of that, a language of expression goes. And when there are similar kinds of exposure, this language of expression can interact. So, the other thing that he wanted to sort of that like there is this kind of a language, the creative language is not confined to only what you call art of the studios or of the museums, but the small craftsmen who worked in the villages, they had also certain specialities which the more sophisticated artists cannot even copy. So, he wanted to think in terms of a total creative spectrum. So, to a certain extent, that idea we sort of benefited from, have a larger idea of what art was and things of that kind. But then, this thing is not always understood by the other people who admire Nandalal. But then, Binod Bihari did, and to a certain Ram Kinkar did. Nandalal was so sort of partial to the kind of creativity of Binod Bihari and Ram Kinkar because of this broadness of vision.